Konnichi! Welcome to another episode of Lingucast. Today we are with Dr. Dirk Elzinga, another linguistics professor here at BYU, and we're excited to talk to him. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you. Dr. Elzinga does phonology, and we're going to find out what that is because people have no clue. So, Dr. Elzinga, first question: what's linguistics, and how do you get passionate about it?
Linguistics is this, I always define it as the systematic study of language. And I use the word systematic on purpose. A lot of people say the scientific study of language, but there are very many linguists who don't really adhere to what you might think of as the traditional scientific method. They'll go out into communities and just, engage speakers where they live and talk with them and write up, their observations about language use, but they're following a particular system. And so I think of it as the systematic study of language. I got interested in linguistics as an undergraduate when I was taking German courses. So my undergraduate degree is actually German language and literature. And I really, really enjoyed the grammar classes and history of the German language and German phonetics. And I thought, I wonder if there's somewhere on campus where I could do more of this. And so I found the linguistics program and just fell in love. I did graduate with my bachelor's degree in German, but then I did a master's degree in linguistics because of that experience.
Very cool. How did you get into your specialty? What is your specialty in linguistics, and how did you get into that?
My specialization is phonology and native languages of North America. I now study specifically the native languages of Utah. I've worked with the Goshute communities, the Western Shoshone, Eastern Shoshone, and the Ute communities on projects involving language documentation, description. I got interested in that as a result of a course I took as an undergraduate in structure of Uto-Aztecan languages. And I thought these are just really, really interesting languages. I then worked for one of the professors as his research assistant, where I was able to kind of work with his field notes and saw how he did his work. And it just all was very, very, very interesting to me. And I wanted to know more about these languages, their history, their speakers, their vitality, and everything I could learn about these indigenous languages was I was up for it.
That's really cool.
A question: what is the difference between phonetics and phonology?
That's a good question. I think that question will continue to be debated for as long as there are phoneticians and phonologists. For me, my working definition of phonetics is the study of speech sounds, more their measurable properties. So if you're looking at vowels, you can say, okay, how long does the vowel last? If you're looking at consonants, you can talk about just how exactly they're formed in the mouth. So you could say the study of the production, the perception of speech sounds, and the acoustic properties of speech sounds. Phonology, I usually define for my students as the study of the patterns of sounds in language. So it incorporates a lot of the findings we have from phonetics, but it goes beyond that. You can also study phonology of signed languages, which is kind of a mind blower because there's no sound. How can you study sounds? Well, it's not really about the sounds. It's about the discrete parts, or what we think of as the discrete parts, the meaningless little bits that we then put together to form more meaningful bits. And in that putting together, things get adjusted and shuffled and arranged. And phonology is the study of how that shuffling and adjustment and arrangement happens.
Can you give us an example of that? How from what I understood right now, phonology is more about the perception, how you view sound, perceive sound, and consider sound in a language specifically. Because I remember learning about phonology that every language has a system, a phonological system that differs from each language. And an example I can think of is a friend of mine asked me, how come Americans, when they hear in German the word, let's say church, Kirche, they hear Kirche, whereas Brazilians, they hear Kirche. Does phonology answer that question?
It can.
Hmm.
So when we listen to language, when we speak, um, we have particular habits of speaking, and those habits of speaking inform how we listen. And so your example of the German word Kirche, in English, we have we don't have the h sound, and so we are not used to listening to that sound, so we try to make sense of it with the phonological system that we have as English speakers, and it might come out something like Kirche with a k. Um, some English speakers might actually use a sh as well.
Yeah.
And the same thing for Brazilian speakers who also do not have the h sound, and so they substitute it for something that they're familiar with because of these habits of pronunciation and of listening that we develop over the course of over the course of acquiring both our native languages.
And can you give us an example of more patterns that like in English, for example, phonological patterns that we can see?
Sure. So one that the and a student, my students kind of like this one. So if you have a word like let's say bat,
Mm-hmm.
winged creature, spooky, Halloween bat, and then you have a word like bad, which is pretty similar to bat. It's just the difference, in bad you have a D and bat you have a T. So okay, well that's the difference between the two words. And that's true, but there's another difference kind of lurking in the background that we don't pay much attention to, but I think, or we don't pay conscious attention to, but which I think serves a very important marker to help distinguish those words. If you pay attention to the way you say bat and compare that to the way you say bad, you'll notice that in the word bat, the vowel is actually quite short, but in bad, it's lengthened.
Right.
And this is not just for those two words, but anytime you have like bit or bid, there's going to be a vowel of different length or back and bag. So anytime you have a difference in that final consonant, the vowel also adjusts itself and shows a difference. And this is something we do automatically. We don't think about it. I'm talking about this vowel adjustment. We don't think about it. We can sort of fake it. So we can say bat or bad. I can make them artificially longer or artificially shorter.
Right.
But when we're just casually speaking, we just do this sort of thing automatically. And these patterns persist from word to word over groups of words that have similar properties. And phonologists look for that kind of thing when they study language.
It's so subtle that we don't, and it's so subtle that we don't notice it.
Right. Or if we do notice it, we could do anything about it, on a consistent basis. That's just our speech habits, and they inform how we speak and how we listen.
So I wonder, with these patterns, do we see kind of consistency across languages, or like patterns that appear in many or most languages, or are they very particular to each language?
As a practice, I start with the assumption that every language is going to have its own set of patterns that are, for practical purposes, I just think of them as separate from any other language.
Sure.
And after I work with them for a little while, I can then start to notice similarities, but you will never have the same pattern that is exactly the same from one language to the next, although there may be broad similarities.
Sure.
So I guess the question is, so is phonology a universal kind of thing?
Yeah.
And it is universal in the sense that all languages have phonology. All languages show patterns of some kind, but it's not universal in that there is a limited set of patterns that all languages kind of pick and choose from. That's hasn't been shown to be the case.
Very interesting.
And how does one get trained in noticing these patterns in phonology? We in phonology and phonetics, we hear about things like allophonic variation. Can you tell us what an allophone is and how that plays a huge role in language perception?
Sure. So the example that I just talked about with bad and bat, we can talk about the length of the vowel a
Mm-hmm.
as being one of these kinds of variables. So for the word bad, the vowel is long. But for bat, the vowel is short. So we can say that the long A and the short A are allophones
Hmm.
of each other. They're sort of variations on the same basic, more abstract vowel.
Hmm.
And we use one in particular situations, we use the other one in other situations. And this kind of variation, this rule governed variation, is what we refer to as allophony. So allophones kind of combining together to show the categories of the phoneme that they belong to.
Interesting. The Can you give us another allophonic variation in English or even German?
Um, sure. So another one in English that's actually quite common that a lot of people know about, and certainly many of your viewers will have heard about this. If you have a P at the very beginning of a word, like say the word pot,
Mm-hmm.
okay, it's accompanied by this puff of air that you can feel when pot. You put your hand in front of your mouth, you can feel a nice strong puff of air when you say a word like pot.
Hmm.
But when you put an S in front of that to get the word spot, that puff of air all but disappears. And so we have a P that's accompanied by a little puff of air, and we have a P that isn't. And so those are allophones of P. And in our writing system, we spell them both with P. So at some level, English speakers think of them as the same thing.
Right.
But in fact, they are pronounced in very different ways.
Hmm. I wonder if mm, this question might take me a minute to articulate, but I wonder if thinking about the connection between orthography and phonology, or maybe the lack thereof, um, when I first started learning about phonology as like a beginning linguistics student, it was hard to kind of separate in my mind, like there's a written word here, but it's not necessarily the same as what I'm saying, or it's not a one-to-one necessarily. Um, do you think it'd be beneficial for in like language arts classes for younger people to kind of learn more about phonology? We learn about grammar and things, but I don't know how much we learn about phonology, at least in my experience.
Um, I don't know. It depends on what you're after.
Mm.
I mean, if you're after, if you're trying to get people to spell more accurately, I'm not sure that it's going to help a lot.
Sure.
I think that's mostly just because of the vagaries of English spelling. It's kind of a hodgepodge system that works pretty well for English,
Mhm.
but maybe it wouldn't work nearly as well for other languages. Um, so this relationship between spoken language and written language has been talked about a lot.
Mhm.
Um, for me, a writing system is basically just a set of mnemonics.
Mm.
We write the things that we want to remember. And I don't think that it's necessary for the average English speaker to remember that the P in pot has a little puff of air,
Right.
or the P in spot doesn't. So we don't put it in our writing system. So there might be some benefit from teaching young people a little bit about phonology, but I'm not sure.
Sure.
I'm not a language pedagogue, and I don't pretend to be one, but I'm just not sure that that's going to be useful.
Sure. That makes sense.
But for language learners, though, that's useful for them. They definitely would benefit of knowing these phonological variations in it. Do you think that kind of like language schools in particular, they kind of lack in teaching things like that?
Oh, you mean second language learners?
Second language learners.
I don't know. I mean, I learned German when I studied German in high school. I finished my degree in German, my undergraduate degree, and we certainly did have training in phonetics. And so, but not so much in high school, but yeah, definitely at the university, I had a whole class on German phonetics,
Hmm.
and we did talk about things like that. Um, But as far as, transferring the written word to spoken language, just learned it sort of on an as needed basis. So we learned that the ch has two sounds, h and h, depending on the vowel that it follows or precedes, or no, the vowel that it follows. And you just learned that. And so we learned a little bit of phonology without being told, now you're going to learn some phonology.
Sure.
So I think that was pretty effective, but otherwise, I just haven't had a lot of experience in language classes where, either good or bad, where phonology was talked about explicitly. Just yeah, that's just because of my experience. So I don't know that I have an opinion on whether they're doing it right or not.
And now, Dr. Elzinga, I have a question. So you've done field work.
Mhm.
Let's say you're similar to Chris Rogers. Let's say you go to a tribe here in Utah or anywhere, and you know nothing of their of the language, or you have no bridge of language to contact them. And you think, I want to document their language, their grammar, their phonology, and the only material you have is a pen and paper or
Mhm.
a pencil and paper. How do you start?
Um, well, I wouldn't know because I have never had to do that. So, um, and that really is something that you ought to ask, a field linguist who's a little more experienced than I am with that kind of thing. I've been lucky in that the communities I worked with, they're all bilingual in their native language as well as English. And some of the groundwork has already been done, so I could go in and say, "Yeah, I was a student of so and so, and he said I should come and visit with you guys." They, "Oh yeah, we remember him. Come on in. Let's talk." Um, so there is sort of a method that was proposed by a linguist named Kenneth Pike
Mm.
for studying a language that, when there is no language in common. And he used to do these demonstrations, and after about 45 minutes, he was able to say, very basic things to this person. And yeah, luckily, I've never had to do that.
And do you have an idea what that consists of? This technique?
Basically, you just point and start saying things like I could point to what you're sitting on and say chair, and they might respond with the word in their language, and you just kind of build up vocabulary that way. Um, like I said, I've never had to try it, so that's my understanding of sort of the mechanism or the procedure. Um, yeah.
And can you tell us a little bit more about your work in phonology, what you've done?
So it's kind of two pronged. So I uh, had a lot of collaborative projects with a faculty member here at BYU. Excuse me. He's since retired, but we had a string of articles on English phonology, and we did some experiments and some surveys where we got people to answer questions about how they said particular words. And from their responses, we were able to discover some kind of interesting things about what happens to consonants in between two syllables. So if you have a word like rabbit, what happens to the B? Does it go with the first syllable or the second syllable, or maybe both at the same time? So we did some we did some studies that dealt with syllable structure in English. For the work that I do with the Numic languages here native to Utah, I'm more interested I'm interested in more fundamental aspects of the language since they haven't had a lot of phonetic description.
Okay.
So I've been able to make recordings from native speakers, and then from those recordings, look at them using instrumental phonetic analysis. One of the projects I'm working on right now involves what we call lenition
Mm.
and go shoot. This is where consonants become um, weaker in particular positions in a word. And so I wanted to find out, so what do we mean when we say weaker? What particular phonetic properties are actually changing for those consonants? And this is kind of basic stuff.
Uh-huh. Interesting.
And can you tell us a little bit more about these processes like lenition and what happens and things that we don't notice?
Um, So specifically in Go Shoot or
In general, like in English, in other languages you've seen.
well, so now we get back to that problem of so this idea of universal processes in language, and so we have an idea that yeah, there are a range of related kinds of changes that happen, and we can assign a label like lenition to those changes. But every language that has lenition does it in just a little bit different way. So in English, we can talk about what happens to T's in a word like atom or pretty, and we could talk about that as a kind of lenition. But in Spanish, which also has lenition, you don't have that same kind of process. Instead, what you have is a b becoming something like a v. And so that's a different kind of lenition. They share kind of a family resemblance. You're making the consonant a little weaker, a little shorter when it happens to sit between vowels. But other than that, there's not a lot that's um, I mean, they need to be treated as distinct processes because they are distinct languages.
Sure. Each language, from what I understand, is like a hierarchy of sounds, and with stronger sounds being considered that more they obstruct the mouth cavity, kind of like that, and then a lenition process would be that gets weaker, like a fricative or things like that.
Sure. Um, so there is so the current thinking in lenition from some phoneticians and phonologists is that lenition is a way to signal that, say, a word or a phrase or even a sentence is ongoing and that you get kind of the opposite effect, the strengthening of consonants at these constituent boundaries. And so lenition is sort of an anti-boundary marker. Says, yeah, this is still part of the same thing. So as an aid in um, parsing and processing, um, I think it's a very interesting idea, very persuasive. I'm not that far along yet with my study of lenition and Go Shoot. But the studies that I have read present I think, a pretty convincing case that that's what a functional aspect of Linux to signal that, yeah, we're still in the middle of this phrase or this sentence.
So I'm always interested in kind of applications of research that people are doing, and then understand that we've talked in other episodes, there's kind of a spectrum of science that can be very directly applied and other kinds of science that is not so much. But in your work, are there kind of applications for the phonetic or for phonological studies that you're doing?
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things that I am doing with the Ute community that I work with, this is the Ute Mountain Utes.
Mm.
They're headquartered in southwestern Colorado. We're developing an orthography, a spelling system that they could then use in official signage on the reservation and official documents that the reservation puts out. And recently, as part of an initiative from the Department of the Interior, a lot of place names are being changed from outdated or potentially offensive names to indigenous names, and I have been consulted several times with members of the committee for that part of Colorado
Very cool.
on. So yeah, we used to call this thing this. How would you spell that in a kind of a user friendly way for Anglos? As they get used to these new place names, and so developing a spelling system for a language is a direct application of
Yeah.
the study of the phonetics and phonology of that language.
I had a discussion with a friend about the development of a orthographics or orthographic orthography orthographic system of spelling. How does one develop that? How does one take into account, like, okay, for example, in English, we or grammarians, they decided, okay, we're not going to take into account the the aspirated p. How does one do that? What kind of choices does one have to make when developing an orthography in a language?
This becomes a very political question.
Yeah.
So one of the things, so if you're a linguist and you're given the responsibility or given the task or the assignment, if you will, of creating a spelling system for a language, the starting point will always be a philological study of that language. And typical procedures that you then represent the phonemes in some way.
Mhm.
Um, and for in the past, for a lot of linguists, that's where it stopped. Okay, here's your orthography, and let me teach it to you. Now you can read and write. Um, I think it's become increasingly important, essential even, that the community gets some kind of input in this procedure. So, for example, the spelling system that we're developing for Ute, I've had a lot of back and forth from members of the community about how I chose to represent things. They found it confusing or helpful, and that has helped me to adjust how that works as they spread out, like show other people, yeah, this is how we're writing things.
Yeah.
They get feedback, and that comes back, and so we change and adjust things more. Um, so yeah, but ultimately it has to start with a sort of a, a phonologically informed uh, understanding of how the sounds of the language works.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah, what fascinates me is, especially in orthography, there are evolutions too. So, do you think that orthography is always catching up I would say, to the pronunciation of a language?
This is one area where it becomes political.
Oh, really?
Absolutely. So German went through an orthographic change, which you may or may not remember. Yeah, and I don't know the new orthography. I mean, there's not a lot that's changed, but there's enough that's changed that when I see modern written German, or I shouldn't say modern, like up to date written German, there are a couple of things I thought, oh, you can do that now, or I didn't realize they changed that as well.
Mm.
Um, and that was literally decades of wrangling on the parts of academics, politicians, interested stakeholders in the process of you know kind of working out some of these changes. Other languages seem to be able to do this a little more readily. So Dutch has undergone several orthographic reforms within the 20th century, and people say, "Okay, yeah, that's the way we do it." English has not gone a serious orthographic. If it has never undergone serious orthographic reform, it just kind of grew. This is just the way we write English, and it's sort of kind of coalesced as the result of people teaching in elementary schools, people teaching foreigners how to read and write. They just developed this system. And so, famously, the British spell things differently than the Americans do
Oh.
because their kind of consensus worked a little bit differently than ours did. And yeah, so it's most definitely a political process.
Now, how does one like do they consult phonologists in matters like that, or
But usually,
not usually? That's so because like, say if something is linguistic, you need to take into account the language or the phonology, and obviously, I believe that when they make a change like that, they want to make it better, like for a reason. And an example is Portuguese has undergone a lot of phonological changes. I can differentiate a 19th century text in Portuguese from a 20th century just by the way even the spelling in Brazil was spelled with a Z and not with an S like today
Mm.
in Portuguese. And so like, do you think that a lot of it has to do with like, okay, we believe we perceive we perceive that this sounds like this, so we're gonna do it. Like German, like you said, that German new orthography at the S set is gone. Now it's just double S. How does do you think that do you think it would be a good idea to consult phonologists in the matters like that?
I don't think so anymore. For languages that have a well-established
Mhm.
spelling system, I don't think that's necessary anymore. I mean, it's not that the nature of German has pronunciation has changed so much that, oh no, now we need to fix the spelling to go along with it. But you had different options, and how these different options played out has changed. So you could always write a double S to so as a pronunciation for the sound S, or you could use an S set for the sound S. So they had both of those options, but how they played out now is pretty much the same. And you don't really need a detailed investigation in the sound structure of German to make those kinds of decisions. Same thing is true for English. Yes, we pronounce things differently than the British do. Sometimes the spelling reflects that, but not very often. And even when it does, we sort of get along, just fine with looking at, people have read enough Harry Potter and enough Tolkien to kind of be familiar with some of the British spelling conventions. Now, when you're dealing with a language that has not previously had a spelling system designed for it, yeah, these things can change quite rapidly.
Mm.
Um, and so my first draft of the spelling system for Ute, I thought was pretty good, but there were aspects of it that confused a lot of people who looked at it. And so fine, I'll change. And so there's been some pretty major things that have changed. As my understanding of Ute phonology has developed and become more nuanced, I realized that some of the spelling choices that I made early on were no longer appropriate, and so I changed them as I needed to. But that's a language that has a very short history of writing, if you could even think of it as a history of writing. There still is no, like, officially recognized orthography for any of the varieties of, well, I shouldn't say that. The officially recognized orthographies of Ute are still not in widespread use. So the Northern Utes have a particular system that they've, at least people who are interested in writing, they become accustomed to. Um, I have a harder time with it. People, the Southern Ute community in Ignacio, they have a system that's a little bit different than what I'm proposing for Ute Mountain. Even in Ute Mountain, there have been people who tried to kind of come up with a spelling system, and none of them vary a lot, but they all vary enough that it's kind of confusing for people, and so
Mm.
working out that consensus becomes an issue. But again, that's a language that doesn't have a long written tradition. So unlike English or Portuguese or German, um, we don't have um, these centuries of practice that we can look back to for ideas on how to create more consistency or more learnability.
Sure. Makes sense. Well, thank you so much for telling us about your work, the research you've done, its applications. Um, One of the last things we wanna ask is what is one thing you wish more people knew about phonology or linguistics in general?
Gosh, I don't know. Come take a class and find out. I mean, I'm just fascinated with phonology. I am fascinated by the idea that we have all of these patterns that we just, like, automatically conform to without thinking about it.
Right.
That we've developed these habits of speech, um, without conscious instruction,
Mm.
um, and that these patterns not only develop this way, but that they're so consistent.
Mm.
I mean, certainly there are going to be there's going to be variation, but the broad strokes of it there's remarkable consistency,
Yeah.
even in the face of kind of ignorance on ignorance is the what's the word? It's the unconscious behavior. So people do this without thinking about it,
Yeah.
without having to think about it. They just do it, and it's like I say, it's remarkably consistent and uh, quite intricate.
Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing and for talking with us today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elzinga. It was my pleasure.